I was asked to say a few words about Sliabh Luachra music from the outside, and I've no choice in doing it but from the outside, because I'm sort of from diagonally across the country from the east coast, from County Louth, the north east of the 26 counties. And I've run the Irish Traditional Music Archive in Dublin, so we have the responsibility of documenting all Irish music, not just on the island of Ireland, but also in the Irish diaspora in the United States and Australia and Britain and so on. And when you stand back from the map of Ireland, there are certain spots on the map that have distinctive musical cultures. You think of Donegal fiddling, you would think of Irish language singing in West Cork, you'd think of concertina playing in County Clare, you would think of flute playing in Sligo, Roscommon, and so on throughout the country. And one of those distinctive spots, one of those hot spots, is Sliabh Luachra. It has a distinctive repertory of music and then a style of playing that repertory of music. And that constitutes a unique contribution to Irish traditional music. I know something about it now, but there was a time when I knew absolutely nothing about it in my younger days, and I only realized when I was thinking of, well, how did I get from knowing nothing at all about it to knowing a certain amount about it? I was thinking there was a kind of a gradual path that I took over the last 50 years, really, and bit by bit I've come to know something more about Sliabh Luachra music. But the point is, the whole country, or at least that part of the country that's interested in traditional music, actually followed the same path. Bit by bit, the music of Sliabh Luachra, known locally to people here, began to kind of spread out so that it's now known not just nationally, not just throughout the island of Ireland, but also internationally. And Sliabh Luachra polkas, slides, with especially distinctive forms of music, are actually known throughout the world. That sounds like a terrible exaggeration, but it's perfectly true. And someone like Matt Cranage, who plays Sliabh Luachra music throughout the world, both knows it's true and is partly responsible for creating that situation. I first was in touch with Sliabh Luachra without knowing it, and that's when at school I would have been learning the poems of Egon O'Rahilly, Gilla na Gilla, Makachani, Carney Gwedid, and so on. And I knew this was some old Irish poet, but that he belonged to a region, that he lived in a particular part of the country. That didn't, at that time, impinge on my thinking. I'd say the first time I heard anything to do with Sliabh Luachra music was from about 1957, because Carolan, the Irish language promotional agency in Dublin, began to make their first sound recordings. And in 1957, they began bringing out 78s, and on one of the early 78s, a bunch of 78s, was Dennis Murphy. And Dennis Murphy, I think, nationally would have been the first Sliabh Luachra musician that was widely heard, because Carolan had a sponsored program, and every week you might hear Dennis Murphy, or every second week anyway. Now, it wasn't quite the first time that Sliabh Luachra music had been heard, because Seamus Ennis, had forerunner of Peter Brown's in RTE, he had come to this district in the late 40s, and he had recorded the famous Pádraig O'Keeffe. And the recordings went to the radio. Kieran McMahon, Andreas O'Gallagher, other people, RTE people were around. But of course, you're talking about a time when most people didn't actually have radios. Radios were reasonably scarce in the late 40s. It was only the 50s there was a kind of an explosion of radio, and especially in the late 50s. And Dennis Murphy was the man, the Sliabh Luachra man, on the spot at that time, promoted by Carolan. And then he became known as Fleadh na Ceol. He's a great traveller, great man for socialising and making friends. And he brought Sliabh Luachra music to Fleadh Ceols up and down the country, county fleadhs, national fleadhs, and he was a well-known and welcome figure. And he then would be heard on the recordings of those Fleadh Ceols on the radio. So right through the 50s, I think Dennis Murphy, more than anyone else, was the man. Sean O'Riordan was connected with Carolan around the 1960s. He was advising them on who they'd record for the 78s. And he himself, in 1960, wrote a play for the Abbey Theatre, for the Dublin Theatre Festival, and it was based on the songs of Owen Rose Sulawain. And that's the second connection that I would have had, because again, I would at school have been learning Owen Rose poems as I thought of them at that time, but of course they were songs. And I only got to know songs when Sean O'Reilly was having Sean O'Shea sing On Roa Sulwan songs on the radio. That would be from about 1962. There'd be Racarach and Riadig Flacol on radio. Great music programs that changed a whole generation's attitude and exposure to Irish traditional music. So On Roa Sulwan and Spalador, Bimi Shigol, Zapoga, Naman, two that stick out in my mind. But I think the real injection of Sliabh Luachra music came in 1969 when Cladder Records brought out an LP called The Star Above the Garter. And that featured, again, Dennis Murphy, but also this time his sister, Julia Clifford. And they played together, and they played solo, and they played airs, but they played a lot of slides and polkas. And it was around that time I was hearing for the first time the name Tom Billy's jigs, and there was more than one of those, and Tom Billy's reel and so on. And people around the country began to learn and play Tom Billy's tunes without really knowing who Tom Billy was at that time, that he was Tom Billy Murphy, a blind fiddle teacher and so on. Around the same time, 1976, the famous collector, somebody that I worked with a lot, Brendan Brannock, brought out the second volume of his really influential collections, Ceol Rinke na Héireann, big fat collection of tunes, and there was a big injection of material there of Sliabh Luachra music, and again especially for Dennis Murphy, because Dennis was the man he was the main carrier of this music around the country. He died in 1974 though, so when Brendan brought out his tunes, he was already dead. And also in the 1970s, 1977, the year after Brendan's volume, there came out from London no fewer than 6 LPs entirely devoted to Sliabh Luachra music. And now people could actually buy Pádraig O'Keeffe on a record. He was in the first LP. He was on the LP with Dennis Murphy and with Julia Clifford. And then there were other Sliabh Luachra people. Johnny O'Leary was on one of those 6 LPs. There was John Clifford and his son Billy Clifford. And there was the young Jackie Daly, who's in the audience there. Jackie had the 6th LP to himself, and that's when the country began to hear Jackie Daly as well, and to appreciate his Sliabh Luachra music. So the thing began snowballing then from the late 1970s. After Dennis Murphy had died, there was a vacuum. Julia Clifford was living in London mostly. She was back and forward a bit. But that vacuum began to be filled then by the famous Johnny O'Leary. Now, Johnny had been playing for 40 years, but kind of quietly and privately and locally with Dennis Murphy. But there was such a demand for people to hear Sliabh Luachra music live that Johnny began to fill the volume. Brendan Brannock and myself brought him to Dublin in 1981 just to give a recital to an organisation called the Folk Music Society of Ireland. I was his driver for that weekend, I remember it well, and he was very happy, relaxed, friendly man. He played his music, very appreciative, silent audience. And I remember picking him up then on Sunday morning, and he was like a different man. He only had one thing in his mind, and that was to get to Houston Station, get on the train, and get back to Sliabh Luachra, because I think he was playing in Ballyconnell's, would it have been, that night, Sunday night, and he was just, it had taken over. So he'd done his Dublin thing, and I got him to the train. And I would meet him then regularly at the Willie Clancy from 1970, well, the mid-70s on, and always accompanied at that time by his daughter Ellen. And now his grandson, Brian, has become famous in the last few months by when it was announced that he's the Young T.G. Cahir Musician of the Year for 2014. I think he was there earlier, was he? Is it? Yeah. And we'll hear him again, I hope. Just staying on the personal thing, I've got another exposure to Sliabh Luachra music then in the 1980s. I belonged to a Colthus branch in one of the Christian Brothers schools on Griffith Avenue in Dublin, the north of Dublin where I live, north side of Dublin. And I met there for the first time Maura O'Keeffe, who was a young trainee teacher in the Marino Training College, and she had been a pupil of Nicky and Anne McAuliffe, who of course are been teaching Sliabh Luachra music and are, I believe, out teaching it tonight as well, which is why they're not here. And that I was then learning some of Nicky and Anne's tunes from Maura O'Keeffe, as we all were in that Coltis branch and people round Dublin at that time. When I began doing radio work in the 80s, I began discovering that actually Dennis Murphy had made 78s away back in New York, something I hadn't known at first. So his Gael Lynn 78s of 1957 on were actually not his first records at all. He had made New York recordings that most people in this country didn't know about, but Harry Bradshaw and myself were able to discover them, find them, play them. And around the same time, we discovered 78s, again from the 1950s, made in Boston by Paddy Cronin. And they're all among the finest recordings of Irish music that have ever been made, leaving Sliabh Luachra aside. And then in 1987, when I was given the job and the responsibility of setting up the Irish Traditional Music Archive and making a national collection, the collection, of course, included Sliabh Luachra music. And now we have hundreds of items with that connection, the Sliabh Luachra connection. We have commercial recordings like the ones I've just mentioned, 78s and LPs and DVDs and CDs and all the rest. We have non-commercial recordings, like a lot of field recordings that Brendan Brannock made of Dennis Murphy and of Johnny O'Leary. We have manuscripts, including, say, the published facsimiles of Pádraig O'Keeffe's manuscripts that Dan Herlihy has published. We have Sliabh Luachra tune books, such as Paul de Lochry's Sliabh Luachra on Parade, that was actually published in the United States. We have song books, we have ballad sheets of Sliabh Luachra connection. We have journals, such as the Journal of Common Luachra. We have dance manuals with polka sets in them. We have academic theses, such as Matt Cranish's PhD thesis on Pádraig O'Keeffe and related items. We have radio programs such as Peter Brown's Sliabh Luachra documentaries. We have histories such as Donal Hickey's Stone Mad for Music. We have festival programs from the Castle Island Festival and other sources. So we have a lot of Sliabh Luachra music. But there was one, speaking personally, there was one more twist to the Sliabh Luachra exposure, and that was when in the early 90s, with the archive launched and growing, my wife and myself were involved in the set dancing craze of that time. We were members of Brooks Academy, a set dancing club in Dublin. And one of the features of the set dancing, as well as learning sets in Dublin, we would go on country weekends, hire a bus, go down the country, learn a local set, and from the local people who knew it or were better. So it was in those years that I was first in Dan Connell's in Knocknagree. I remember dancing in Fleming's of Scarlett Glen, and I've just met Tom Fleming there. I don't think I met him in those days. Would have known Jimmy O'Brien's in Killarney and so on. So we had the personal exposure, and then I had professional exposure to all of this. And out of those Brooks Academy trips came a magnificent collection of tunes, the largest collection, I think, I can say without contradiction, of Sliabh Luachra music in existence. And that was Terry Moylan. Terry was one of the Brooks Academy founders, leaders, dancer, but also musician, tune collector, and he recorded all of Johnny Leary's music. And there are about 350 tunes in the book. So Johnny O'Leary of Sliabh Luachra dance music from the Cork-Kerry border, and that's a major collection of Sliabh Luachra music in print. It's been out of print, and Terry has done a second edition, which will appear this year, and he's got an extra 10 tunes, so it'll remain the largest collection of Sliabh Luachra music. So final point, while the music, the song, the dances of Sliabh Luachra are of course primarily for enjoyment at home and in your own region and throughout the country, and as I say now, internationally. There's also a dimension of social history and social identity, local identity involved with all of this. And there's still a lot of research to be done on Sliabh Luachra music. There are mysterious aspects to it. There are whole layers, different layers of tradition that are surviving, and they're kind of mixed up together. There's an Irish language tradition and their outside international popular music traditions that came in. For instance, the slides and the polkas that are so distinctive that everyone thinks of Sliabh Luachra when they hear them. Where are they from? There's a song input. Some of the tunes are actually song tunes, Irish language song tunes. Some of them are Scottish tunes in print in Scotland and maybe came in here in print. How old are these slides and polkas? How modern are they? What was the contribution of certain gifted individuals like Pádraig O'Keeffe to their creation? Not just their playing and their transmission, but did he compose them? Who composed them? Where did they come from? So all these mysterious items have still to be nailed down, I think. I remember, again, when I met Máire O'Keeffe and getting intrigued with polkas, I thought I would collect every polka, write them all down, and see if I could make any sense out of them. But I actually gave up because very quickly there were simply too many, and I was in the wrong part of the country, and I didn't know enough people, and so on. But I knew even then, and that back in the 80s, that there is an unexamined dimension to Sliabh Luachra music that has yet to be discovered, worked on, nailed down. We have published just before Christmas there, the second volume of a big collection, over 1,000 tunes from Kerry, tunes of the Munster Pipers, that were written down in the 1860s by a Kerry piper, the Reverend James Goodman from Ventry. And there are no slides and polkas in it. So that's 1860s Kerry music. Why isn't there a connection with Sliabh Luachra music, you would expect? So these are just some of the mysteries. We're on the internet, we've published several hundred tunes collected by the South Limerick tune collector Patrick Weston Joyce, whose centenary occurs this year. Again, what's the connection then between Limerick traditional music, Kerry traditional music, not to mind just Cork and Kerry? These are questions that one hopes will someday be answered. So there's a lot of material out there to be researched, not just in the Irish Traditional Music Archive, but other repositories like the National Folklore Collection in UCD. One job that does need to be done is the collection of Pádraig O'Keeffe's music. Matt Cranage would know this better than any. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of pieces of paper scattered around Ireland, and to go no further, which Pádraig O'Keeffe wrote down tunes and gave to pupils. You've all seen examples of them and you know them. Some people I know have hundreds of them, and other people have other hundreds of them, and they overlap because obviously he taught the same tune to different pupils and so on. So there's a need to pull together. It's a kind of a central thing for Sliabh Luachra people, I think, to pull together the definitive collection of Pádraig O'Keeffe's music. Last year we were in touch with a former pupil of Pádraig O'Keeffe's. Pod Collins is his name, from Knocknagoshel, a man in his 60s now, I guess. And he gave us all his Pádraig O'Keeffe manuscripts. We scanned them all, and they're up on the internet site of the Irish Traditional Music Archive. Not just fiddle manuscripts, fiddle tunes, but also accordion tunes, because as you know he taught both, and the concertina. And we have, in the last week, we have turned 77 of those Pádraig O'Keeffe tunes into interactive music files. That means if you don't read music, it doesn't matter, you can go onto our site, and by navigating these 77 tunes, the machine will play them back to you. We've created digital audio files for these tunes. So as of tonight, we put them up, they're up there now. If you go onto our website, which is itma.ie, you go onto our website tonight when you go home, you can play back 77, only 77 of Pádraig O'Keeffe's tunes, taken directly from his own manuscripts, written by his own hand for his own fiddle pupils in the 1950s and 60s. I won't say anything much more, except that I wish the project success. It will be successful, I know it will be. I think there will be strength in that unity that I spoke of earlier, and we have the archive, and some of my colleagues have been talking to Cian, and we will be down later in the year to document some of the activity that happens as part of this heritage trail, to collect music and the other social activities, dance, song, and so on. But I would say, finally, so much will be happening that a single national organisation couldn't hope to document and recover it. And that really was back to local effort and people locally who are on the spot. Tape recorders and video recorders are relatively cheap, very common, and that's all you need really to document for the future what will be produced as living music during this year. So I wish the project well, and I hope to be down later. Thank you.